B.2.2. Does the state have subsidiary functions? Yes, it does. While, as discussed in the last section, the state is an instrument to maintain class rule, this does not mean that it is limited to just defending the social relationships in a society and the economic and political sources of those relationships. No state has ever left its activities at the bare minimum. As well as defending the rich, their property, and the specific forms of property rights they favored, the state has numerous other subsidiary functions. What these are has varied considerably over time and space, and consequently, it would be impossible to list them all. However, why it does is more straightforward. We can generalize two main forms of subsidiary functions of the state. The first one is to boost the interests of the ruling elite, either nationally or internationally, beyond just defending their property. The second is to protect society against the negative effects of the capitalist market. We will discuss each in turn, and for simplicity and relevance, we will concentrate on capitalism. See also section D.1. The first main subsidiary function of the state is when it intervenes in society to help the capitalist class in some way. This can take obvious forms of intervention, such as subsidies, tax breaks, non-bid government contracts, protective tariffs to old, inefficient industries, giving actual monopolies to certain firms or individuals, bailouts of corporations judged by the state bureaucrats as too important to let fail, and so on. However, the state intervenes far more than that and in more subtle ways. Usually, it does so to solve problems that arise in the course of capitalist development and which cannot, in general, be left to the market, at least initially. These are designed to benefit the capitalist class as a whole, rather than just specific individuals, companies, or sectors. These interventions have taken different forms in different times and include state funding for industry, for example, military spending, the creation of social infrastructure too expensive for private capital to provide, railways and motorways, the funding of research that companies cannot afford to undertake, protective tariffs to protect developing industries from more efficient international competition, the key to successful industrialization as it allows capitalists to rip off consumers, making them rich and increasing funds available for investment, giving capitalists preferential access to land and other natural resources, providing education to the general public that ensures they have the skills and attitude required by capitalists and the state. It is no accident that a key thing learned in school is how to survive boredom, being in a hierarchy and to do what it orders, imperialist ventures to create colonies or client states, or protect citizens' capital invested abroad in order to create markets or get access to raw materials and cheap labor, government spending to stimulate consumer demand in the face of recession and stagnation, maintaining a natural level of unemployment that can be used to discipline the working class, so ensuring they produce more for less, manipulating the interest rate in order to try and reduce the effects of the business cycle and undermine workers' gains in the class struggle. These actions and others like it ensures that a key role of the state within capitalism, open quote, is essentially to socialize risk and cost and to privatize power and profit. Unsurprisingly, with all the talk about minimizing the state, in the OECD countries, the state continues to grow relative to GNP, end quote. Hence, David de Leon, open quote, above all, the state remains an institution for the continuance of dominant socioeconomic relations, whether through such agencies as the military, the courts, politics, or the police. Contemporary states have acquired less primitive means to reinforce their property systems than state violence, which is always the means of last, often first, resort. States can regulate, moderate, or resolve tensions in the economy by preventing the bankruptcies of key corporations, manipulating the economy through interest rates, supporting hierarchical ideology through tax benefits for churches and schools, and other tactics. In essence, it is not a neutral institution. It is powerfully for the status quo. The capitalist state, for example, is virtually a gyroscope centered in capital, balancing the system. If one sector of the economy earns a level of profit, let us say, that harms the rest of the system, such as oil producers causing public resentment and increased manufacturing costs, the state may redistribute some of that profit through taxation or offer encouragement to competitors." End quote. In other words, the state acts to protect the long-term interests of the capitalist class as a whole and ensure its own survival by protecting the system. This role can and does clash with the interests of particular capitalists or even whole sections of the ruling class. See section B.2.6. But this conflict does not change the role of the state as the property owner's policeman. Indeed, the state can be considered as a means for settling, in a peaceful and apparently independent manner, upper-class disputes over what to do to keep the system going. This subsidiary role, it must be stressed, is no accident. It is part and parcel capitalism. Indeed, open quote, "Successful industrial societies have consistently relied on departures from market orthodoxies while condemning their victims at home and abroad to market discipline." End quote. While such state intervention grew greatly after the Second World War, the role of the state as active promoter of the capitalist class, rather than just its passive defender as implied in capitalist ideology, i.e. as defender of property, has always been a feature of the system. As Kropotkin put it, open quote, "Every state reduces the peasants and the industrial workers to a life of misery by means of taxes and through the monopolies it creates in favor of the landlords, the cotton lords, the railway magnates, the publicans, and the like. We need only to look around to see how everywhere in Europe and America the states are constituting monopolies in favor of capitalists at home and still more in conquered lands, which are part of their empires." End quote. By monopolies, it should be noted, Kropotkin meant general privileges and benefits, rather than giving a certain firm total control over a market. This continues to this day by such means as, for example, privatizing industries but providing them with state subsidies, or by mislabeled free trade agreements which impose protectionist measures such as intellectual property rights on the world market. All this means that capitalism has rarely relied on purely economic power to keep the capitalists in their social position of dominance, either nationally vis-à-vis the working class or internationally vis-à-vis competing foreign elites. While a free market capitalist regime in which the state reduces its intervention to simply protecting capitalist property rights has been approximated on a few occasions, this is not the standard state of the system. Direct force, i.e. state action, almost always supplements it. This is most obviously the case during the birth of capitalist production. Then the bourgeoisie wants and uses the power of the state to regulate wages, i.e. to keep them down to such levels as to maximize profits and force people to attend work regularly, to lengthen the working day and to keep the laborer dependent on wage labor as their own means of income, by such means as enclosing land, enforcing property rights on unoccupied land, and so forth. As capitalism is not, and has never been, a natural development in society, it is not surprising that more and more state intervention is required to keep it going. And if even this was not the case, if force was essential to creating the system in the first place, the fact that it latter can survive without further direct intervention does not make the system any less statist. As such, regulation and other forms of state intervention continue to be used in order to skew the market in favor of the rich and so force working people to sell their labor on the boss's terms. This form of state intervention is designed to prevent those greater evils which might threaten the efficiency of a capitalist economy or the social and economic position of the bosses. It is designed not to provide positive benefits for those subject to the elite, although this may be a side effect. Which brings us to the other kind of state intervention, the attempts by society, by means of the state, to protect itself against the eroding effects of the capitalist market system. Capitalism is an inherently antisocial system. By trying to treat labor, people, and land, the environment, as commodities, it has to break down communities and weaken ecosystems. This cannot but harm those subject to it, and as a consequence, this leads to pressure on government to intervene to mitigate the most damaging effects of unrestrained capitalism. Therefore, on one side, there is the historical movement of the market, a movement that has no inherent limit and that therefore threatens society's very existence. On the other, there is society's natural propensity to defend itself and, therefore, to create institutions for its protection. Combine this with a desire for justice on behalf of the oppressed, along with opposition to the worst inequalities and abuses of power and wealth, and we have the potential for the state to act to combat the worst excesses of the system in order to keep the system as a whole going. After all, the government, open quote, cannot want society to break up, for it would mean that it and the dominant class would be deprived of the sources of exploitation, end quote. Needless to say, the thrust for any system of social protection usually comes from below, from the people most directly affected by the negative effects of capitalism. In the face of mass protests, the state may be used to grant concessions to the working class in cases where not doing so would threaten the integrity of the system as a whole. Thus, social struggle is the dynamic for understanding many, if not all, of the subsidiary functions acquired by the state over the years. This applies to pro-capitalist functions as they are usually driven by the need to bolster the profits and power of capitalists at the expense of the working class. State legislation to set the length of the working day is an obvious example of this. In the early period of capitalist development, the economic position of the capitalists was secure, and consequently, the state happily ignored the lengthening working day, thus allowing capitalists to appropriate more surplus value from workers and increase the rate of profit without interference. Whatever protests erupted were handled by troops. Later, however, after workers began to organize on a wider and wider scale, reducing the length of the working day became a key demand around which revolutionary socialist fervor was developing. In order to diffuse this threat, and socialist revolution is the worst-case scenario for the capitalist, the state passed legislation to reduce the length of the working day. Initially, the state was functioning purely as the protector of the capitalist class, using its powers simply to defend the property of the few against the many who used it, i.e., repressing the labor movement to allow the capitalists to do as they liked. In the second period, the state was granting concessions to the working class to eliminate a threat to the integrity of the system as a whole. Needless to say, once workers' struggle calmed down and their bargaining position reduced by the normal workings of market, see section B.2.2, the legislation restricting the working day was happily ignored and became dead laws. This suggests that there is a continuing tension and conflict between the efforts to establish, maintain, and spread the free market and the efforts to protect people in society from the consequences of its workings. Who wins this conflict depends on the relative strength of those involved, as does the actual reforms agreed to. Ultimately, what the state concedes, it can also take back. Thus, the rise and fall of the welfare state, granted to stop more revolutionary change, see section D.1.3, it did not fundamentally challenge the existence of wage labor and was useful as a means of regulating capitalism, but was reformed, i.e. made worse rather than better, when it conflicted with the needs of the capitalist economy and the ruling elite felt strong enough to do so. Of course, this form of state intervention does not change the nature nor the role of the state as an instrument of minority power. Indeed, that nature cannot help but shape how the state tries to implement social protection, and so, if the state assumes functions, it does so as much in the immediate interest of the capitalist class as in the interest of society in general. Even where it takes action under pressure from the general population or to try and mend the harm done by the capitalist market, its class and hierarchical character twists the results in ways useful primarily to the capitalist class itself. This can be seen from how labor legislation is applied, for example. Thus, even the good functions of the state are penetrated with and dominated by the state's hierarchical nature. As Malatesta forcefully put it, open quote, "The basic function of government is always that of oppressing and exploiting the masses, of defending the oppressors and the exploiters. It is true that to these basic functions, other functions have been added in the course of history. Hardly ever has a government existed which did not combine with its oppressive and plundering activities others which were useful to social life. But this does not detract from the fact that government is by nature oppressive, and that it is in origin and by its attitude inevitably inclined to defend and strengthen the dominant class. Indeed, it confirms and aggravates the position. It is enough to understand how and why it carries out these functions to find the practical evidence that whatever governments do is always motivated by the desire to dominate, and is always geared to defending, extending, and perpetuating its privileges and those of the class of which it is both the representative and defender." End quote. This does not mean that these reforms should be abolished. The alternative is often worse, as neoliberalism shows. It simply recognizes that the state is not a neutral body and cannot be expected to act as if it were, which ironically indicates another aspect of social protection reforms within capitalism. They make for good PR. By appearing to care for the interests of those harmed by capitalism, the state can obscure its real nature. Open quote. "A government cannot maintain itself for long without hiding its true nature behind a pretense of general usefulness. It cannot impose respect for the lives of the privileged if it does not appear to demand respect for all human life. It cannot impose acceptance of the privileges of the few if it does not pretend to be the guardian of the rights of all." End quote. Obviously, being an instrument of the ruling elite, the state can hardly be relied upon to control the system which that elite runs. As we discuss in the next section, even in a democracy, the state is run and controlled by the wealthy, making it unlikely that pro-people legislation will be introduced or enforced without substantial popular pressure. That is why anarchists favor direct action and extra-parliamentary organizing. See section J.2 and J.5 for details. Ultimately, even basic civil liberties and rights are the product of direct action, of, open quote, "mass movements among the people to wrest these rights from the ruling classes who would have never consented to them voluntarily." End quote. Equally obviously, the ruling elite and its defenders hate any legislation it does not favor, while, of course, remaining silent on its own use of the state. As Benjamin Tucker pointed out about the free market capitalist Herbert Spencer, open quote, "Amid his multitudinous illustrations of the evils of legislation, he, in every instance, cites some law passed, ostensibly at least, to protect labor, alleviating suffering, or promote the people's welfare. But never once does he call attention to the far more deadly and deep-seated evils growing out of the innumerable laws creating privilege and sustaining monopoly." End quote. Such hypocrisy is staggering, but all too common in the ranks of supporters of free market capitalism. Finally, it must be stressed that none of these subsidiary functions implies that capitalism can be changed through a series of piecemeal reforms into a benevolent system that primarily serves working class interests. To the contrary, these functions grow out of and supplement the basic role of the state as the protector of capitalist property and the social relations they generate, i.e., the foundation of the capitalist's ability to exploit. Therefore, reforms may modify the functioning of capitalism, but they can never threaten its basis. In summary, while the level and nature of statist intervention on behalf of the employing classes may vary, it is always there. No matter what activity it conducts beyond its primary function of protecting private property, what subsidiary functions it takes on, the state always operates as an instrument of the ruling class. This applies even to those subsidiary functions which have been imposed on the state by the general public. Even the most popular reform will be twisted to benefit the state or capital, if at all possible. This is not to dismiss all attempts at reform as irrelevant. It simply means recognizing that we, the oppressed, need to rely on our own strength and organizations to improve our circumstances.